When you see this car, who do you think of? For some, this person is unmistakable. For those that don't know him, this is Kenneth Paul Block, known professionally as Ken Block, and he's probably one of the most influential people for anything on wheels. Part 1. Before he became Ken Block. Ken was born in 1967 in Long Beach, California, to well-off but not necessarily rich parents, and from a very early age was into all things rebellious and dangerous. He listened to plenty of classic punk and hard rock, and also frequented several local skate parks, as well as participating in dirt biking and some snowboarding. This would eventually lead to one of the greatest financial decisions he ever made. After graduating high school, Ken decided his true calling was to become a, quote, snowboard bum, and he moved to the mountains of Colorado to pursue this dream. However, not long after, he returned to Southern California to pursue a more stable job. He still wanted to work in something that was fun and more creatively focused, so he ended up majoring in design, although he wouldn't stay with this for very long either. During his time in college, he began making sports-oriented clothing and shoes with a couple of friends, particularly Damon Way, the brother of professional skateboarder Danny Way. And these were quickly gaining traction. They made it official in 1991, forming the era-defining company 8-Ball Clothing, which, due to a lawsuit, was later renamed to Drawers Clothing in 1994, and eventually solidified into the brand we know today as DC Shoes.
Fresh out the house, got the beat on suicide as I ride up and down Martin Luther King Drive. Standing tall, looking down on the bloody boys, snitching all day. I look brown on the coming in.
DC marketed itself as a brand for athletic and sport-oriented shoes, with the focus being on skateboarding. The founding by Ken and Damon, along with the aforementioned Danny Way, and later contributions by notable figures in the space, such as Rob Dyrdek, DC would come to be a juggernaut in the skate shoes space, which at that point was primarily dominated by Vans. Only 2 years after founding, DC was already making $7 million in sales, and by 2000, they were making nearly 10 times that. In 2004, Ken and Damon sold a majority of the company to Quicksilver for $87 million, bringing the company's total value to nearly $1 billion. Although his role in the company diminished very quickly following the sale, he was still partnered with the brand, and was often seen with the DC logo plastered alongside anything else he was working on. By this point, Ken was an extremely wealthy man, and even though he didn't necessarily grow up poor, he was effectively minted before the age of 40. With this wealth, he had started investing more into his other passions like snowboarding and motocross, along with other extreme sports. But there was one that would go on to change the rest of his life. Part 2. Motorsport Aspirations. When he was younger, he caught moments of this crazy looking form of racing that he saw of VHS tapes in the 80s and 90s. It was originally only broadcast in Europe, so he could only see so much because he had to have someone bootleg it and send it over. But what he saw was incredible. The images of cars barreling down tight forested roads, the sounds of 600 plus horsepower bursting out of cars that look like they'd be better suited puttering to the grocery store, and the insane technique on display from the drivers, who were always just on the edge of control. Ken was especially drawn to one driver in particular, Colin McRae, who was known as the Flying Scotsman for his incredibly fearless driving style and his notable Scottish articulation.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about Colin was, like, he was such a big influence on me ever becoming a rally driver. I loved rally as a kid. It didn't have much coverage in the States, but from what I could see of it, it was the motorsport that, like, spoke to me. And then Colin was the driver that really made it step up a whole nother level, because the way that he drove, the way that he embodied the sport, the way he had fun with the car, that just spoke to me in such a different way than any other driver that I saw in the WRC.
What Ken saw was incredible. What he saw was rally racing. Rallying is one of, if not the oldest forms of motorsport still around today. However, unlike traditional open wheel or especially stock car racing, it took much longer to catch on in America, meaning that when Ken was growing up, the opportunities to participate in rallies were relatively few and far between. But this changed in 2005 when he became good friends with and started being coached by one Travis Pastrana. Travis was already somewhat established in the space, having started out racing motocross in the late 90s, and participated in his first car rally in 2001. But he made his proper rally debut in 2003 with the Subaru-backed Vermont Sports Car Rally Team. He participated in and won a total of 11 gold medals in the Summer X Games in both motocross and rally cars, and he would eventually become a 4-time Rally America champion, winning the cup from 2006 to 2009. He would go on to have a very successful racing career, racing in various divisions and even having a couple spots in the WRC, and even competing in NASCAR at various times in the late 2000s and 2010s. But what's important to this story is how, in 2005, he became good friends with Ken Block, and introduced him to the American rally divisions. Ken, who had already developed an interest in rally, was shocked to learn that there were American leagues for it, as he had previously only thought of them as being a European thing. After making this discovery, he started participating in rallies under the same Vermont sports car team that Travis had raced for. As much as Ken would go on to be more associated with the Ford rally division, especially their Focus and Fiesta hatchbacks, he actually started his rallying career with a Subaru WRX, which was a great tool to sharpen his skills on during those early years. To be honest, Ken Block was never the fastest driver. He would win plenty of events, sure, but rarely enough to score a championship, and almost never in any top tier leagues. He would compete in a total of 24 WRC rallies, never completing a full season, and only ever having a highest finishing position of 7th in the Mexican stage in 2013. He fared much better in his American rally expeditions, getting 3 separate runner-up finishes in the Rally America Championship, which sounds good until you remember that his friend Travis scored the cup 4 times in a row from 06 to 09. Although Travis would never compete properly in the WRC, he was regarded as a great rallying talent of that time, although the biggest hurdle preventing Ken from climbing up the ranks seemed less like his competition and more himself, or more specifically, his age. When Travis won his first championship in 2006, he did so at a sprightly 23, but Ken, who had never even stepped into a rally car until he was nearly 40, and few people his age and with his little experience had the pace to even begin rallying, let alone hang with the big players of the time. But that never got him down. He loved rallying and wanted to continue doing it. Around this time, he also began competing in the X Games Rallycross divisions, which he would score a total of 5 podiums in across a decade of competition. These sorts of events and stunts would seemingly be the inspiration for something that Ken would later go on to be synonymous with. Part 3. Gymkhana. Now, Ken Block didn't invent Gymkhana. Arguably it dates back to the Mongolian Empire? Okay, sure. But he was a massive figure in popularizing it. But let's lay out some background for those unfamiliar with it. Gymkhana, at least as we know it today, began like many other forms of motorsport, but instead of testing the reliability and power of the cars like early Grand Prix and endurance races had, Gymkhana racing focused on the car's handling, which at this point was fairly limited. So it was primarily the driver's job to attempt to maneuver the car around the often carefully constructed and laid out tracks, while trying to do so in the shortest possible time. In terms of appearance, it lies somewhere between modern autocross and professional drifting, with the courses generally being less than a minute and a half in length, although Ken was often less concerned about getting the quickest time possible and more with just having as much fun and looking as cool as possible while he was doing it. In late 2008, he got permission from his rally team to use one of their cars for a Gymkhana filming day in collaboration with DC Shoes. This was the result. This would go on to be known as Ken Block Gymkhana 1, and was a very strong indicator of what was to come. It featured a purpose-built 500 horsepower all-wheel drive beast barreling down a vacant lot, doing very technical and difficult drifts and maneuvers, and even having a bit of extra showmanship near the end, when Ken was just seen doing donuts around a guy riding a Segway. Even though he would do more impressive things in the future, this video was still very impressive and very unique for its time. And it wouldn't be long before it got a sequel, Gymkhana 2, which was made in direct partnership with DC Shoes, and was even put up on their YouTube channel instead of Ken's personal channel. By this time, he had also established his signature style, or more specifically, his color scheme. Fluorescent Monster Energy green, atop a mixture of black and white or silver, then usually accented with hints of orange and blue. Together, this would be the go-to style for the majority of things Ken worked on in the years that followed. At the start of 2010, Ken Block ended his partnership with Subaru and instead joined up with Ford for practically all of his future racing endeavors, under the Monster World Rally team, which Ken was instrumental in creating. That team would later go on to be rebranded as something many of you are likely familiar with, although before we get to that, let's get back to the Gymkhanas. Now, I want you to do something for me. I know I've been talking about events from 2010, but I want you to stop and really think about that time.
You don't have to come and confess, we're looking for you, we gon' find you, we gon' find you.
Oh my god, it's a double rainbow all the way.
You got it? Okay. Gymkhana 3 was a massive event back in 2010, and I didn't realize that until I went back and checked. By the end of that year, it had over 22 million views, which was unheard of at that time. To be frank, all the Gymkhana videos were very successful online. Even Gymkhana 1 broke the 2 million mark just a month after release, back when YouTube looked like this. Yeah. This was before most YouTubers even had the ability to add thumbnails to their videos, and yet Ken Block and his team were pushing out content that millions of people were watching. This made it apparent just how good of an entertainer and showman he really was, and as much as I hate to admit it, he could even be classed as one of the world's first proper online influencers, as his reach stretched across the globe and he was able to get his ideas out to thousands and millions in just days. This was also around the time he would start appearing in other media outside of his own videos, particularly in video games. One of his earliest appearances was in Codemaster's iconic Dirt 2 from 2009, along with other notable rally drivers of the time. But its successor, Dirt 3, featured Ken Block so much that his most recent WRC car was actually what they used on the cover. They also included several Gymkhana events, most of which Ken featured in some way, primarily as a teacher or instructor. Around 2013, he also served as a racing advisor for the Need for Speed franchise, particularly Rivals, which I assume is the reason why Gymkhana 6 is primarily only available on the Need for Speed YouTube channel, although it's currently unlisted for whatever reason. Not long after, his cars also started showing up in the Forza series, particularly his Ford rally cars, which were all over Forza Horizon 4 and 5, alongside many other creations by him and his team. Which reminds me, before we go any further, I need to define something. Part 4. Hoonigan. Etymology Australian, derived from the term hooligan, a person who operates a motor vehicle in an aggressive and unorthodox manner consisting of, but not limited to, drifting, burnouts, donuts, as well as acts of automotive aeronautics. One who hoons. This would go on to be a mantra for basically everything he did going forward. In 2012, he formed the Hoonigan Company, and later in 2013, his rally team was rebranded as the Hoonigan Racing Division. Hoonigan started uploading content to their YouTube channel in mid-2012, originally just focusing on the act of hooning itself, although they later expanded to car breakdowns, car builds, drag races, car comparisons, fun tests, and still generally just hooning around. This would also go on to be the home of the Gymkhana series after Gymkhana 6, all the way up to Gymkhana 10, including its later spin-offs, Climbkhana, Terrakhana, and Electricana, as well as the 2 Travis Pastrana specials in 2020 and 2022 respectively. In the last decade, Ken Block featured in plenty of content, both on his own personal channel as well as the key figure on the Hoonigan channel. And that didn't even stop him from racing, as he was still competing in rally championships as recently as 2018. At the start of 2021, he actually parted ways with his rally partners in Ford, and would go on to partner with both Audi and Hyundai for many of his future exploits. In 2020 onwards, Ken started to take a backseat to the operations and appearances for Hoonigan, although he was still very present. He also began helping his eldest daughter, Leah Block, in growing and developing as another generation of rallying protege and extraordinary car enthusiast. I think many of you know what happens next. It's probably the reason why you clicked on this video. On a cold winter's day in northern Utah, not far from the Block family home, Ken was out riding snowmobiles with his family, doing what he loved with the people he loved. But that day was cut short when Ken was heading back up one of the hills when the snowmobile suddenly went end over end, falling on top of Ken, killing him instantly. The shockwaves were felt across the internet, with everyone from Tony Hawk to Rob Dyrdek to Travis Pastrana all mourning the loss of their dear friend. And thousands more across the internet showed their support and reverence for Ken and his family. His influence becoming immediately apparent just by the number of people who talked about him after his passing. Soon after, the Block family would partner with Hoonigan to create the 43 Institute, which uses the donations it receives to support everything that Ken stood for and that he loved. I'll leave a link to it in the description for anyone that wants to donate. Ken Block was a man who affected millions and practically changed every field he entered, and always for the better. A lover of all things fast, dangerous, and fun. Was he the fastest racing driver of all time? No. But arguably, he was the greatest of all time.